You can't mention Gladys Knight without mentioning one of the greatest voices in American music, who has spent more than 6 decades redefining emotion in soul and R&B with a voice that is both powerful and deeply resonant. Starting from small stages with Gladys Knight and the Pips, she gradually turned her name into a global icon, especially with classic songs like Midnight Train to Georgia, Neither One of Us, or If I Were Your Woman, songs that not only topped the charts, but also became collective memories for many generations. She has won 7 Grammy Awards, an achievement that not many artists can reach, and was honored at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as recognition for her long-lasting influence on world music. Not stopping there, she also has a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, appeared in many television programs, and collaborated with big names, creating timeless, iconic products. With millions of records sold and a musical legacy that has spread across many decades, Gladys Knight is not just a singer, but a standard of perseverance and class in the entertainment industry. But behind all those achievements is a battle that no audience has ever witnessed in full. When the stage lights go out, when the applause fades into the background, she has to face the silences that fame cannot fill. There were periods in her life when she almost lost control of herself, getting swept into habits and choices that made everything more fragile than ever. Broken marriages, prolonged pressures, and mistakes she couldn't deny created a completely opposite side to the perfect image in front of the public. There were times when she no longer recognized who the woman in the mirror was, when success no longer brought a feeling of victory, but only left fatigue and emptiness. But what makes her story different is not that she fell, but that she chose to stand up. Without fanfare, without ostentation, she gradually reclaimed her life, returning to the values that had once saved her from the beginning. It is that quiet will, that determination that doesn't need anyone to witness it, that has kept her standing firm until today, when everything around her may change, but she is no longer willing to lose herself one more time. Before we continue into the journey behind the lights of Gladys Knight, please hit subscribe and leave a heart, a small sign for the woman who almost lost herself but still chose to stand up. And if this story touches you, don't leave, because the next part will take you back to where it all began, where a voice was born, not from glory, but from deprivation and silence. Before the world knew Gladys Knight as a voice that could touch the deepest places in the human heart, she was just a little girl growing up in Atlanta, in a house where music and faith were not just habits, but the only way to survive. Sunday mornings never started with the laziness of childhood, but with the call to prepare to go to church, where she learned to raise her voice before fully understanding the meaning of the lyrics she was singing. In the narrow space of the wooden pews and the soft light from the windows, her voice rang out not to impress, but as a way to hold on to attention, to not be submerged in a world too vast for a child. The adults around her not only listened, they expected, they looked at her as if they had already seen something that she herself hadn't yet realized. And from very early on, Gladys understood that her voice no longer belonged to herself alone. It became the pride of the family, the hope, the promise of a different future, where difficulties could be replaced by opportunities. But for a child, the adult's hope is sometimes not light, but an invisible burden weighing on the shoulders. When other children were still running and jumping on the streets, Gladys was standing in front of adults, trying to sing really well, really accurately, really perfectly every note. No one said outright to her that she had to be perfect, but the way they looked, the way they silently waited, said it all. Each performance was not just a moment, but a test, and each time it ended, even though she received applause, she still carried the feeling that she had to do better next time. Her childhood did not disappear in one day. It was gradually replaced by responsibility, by the awareness that she was representing something bigger than herself. When she participated in and won the Ted Mack's Original Amateur Hour competition at an age when many children still hadn't fully understood the world around them, that moment was not just joy, but a turning point. From that moment, she was no longer a little girl who sang well, but became someone who had to prove that success was not just temporary luck. And sometimes, the most painful thing is not being forced, but that she herself began to believe that she was not allowed to fail. The family was always there, always loving her in their way, but that love was never separate from expectations. Words of encouragement came with hopeful looks. Satisfied nods came with silence when things weren't good enough. She did not lack affection, but that affection was tied to her having to continue moving forward, having to continue becoming what everyone believed she could become. And in that journey, Gladys gradually learned something that no child should learn too early: to be strong even when not yet ready. There were times she was tired, there were times she wanted to stop, but that feeling was quickly replaced by the thought that she had no right to be weak. When you become the hope of the whole family, stopping is no longer a simple choice. Those years shaped her in a way that the world would later call resilient. But inside that resilience was a little girl who had become accustomed to suppressing her emotions, accustomed to putting others' needs first, accustomed to continuing to walk, even when no longer sure where she was going. Her voice became increasingly powerful, increasingly profound, but perhaps precisely because it was formed from years when emotions were not allowed to be weak, it carried a sadness that listeners could feel, but not everyone understood its origin. And when the world later listened to Gladys Knight, they would say that that voice was full of emotion, full of experience, as if she had lived through more than what her age allowed. What they didn't know was that that emotion did not come from the years later, but had begun when she was still a child, standing in a small church in Atlanta, trying to sing really well so as not to disappoint anyone, while she herself had never been allowed to ask what she truly wanted. The victory at Ted Mack's original amateur hour came to Gladys Knight like a door opening before her eyes, but it was not a door leading to freedom, but a path that took her deeper into a world she was not yet prepared to face. When the stage lights first shone directly on that young face, everyone saw a star forming, a rare talent, a voice that could go further than anyone imagined. But for Gladys, that moment was not like a complete victory. It was like an affirmation that from now on, she was no longer allowed to go back to being a normal child. The praises, the rounds of applause, the admiring eyes began to change the way people looked at her, and gradually changed the way she looked at herself as well. After the competition, performance invitations began to appear more frequently. No longer were they safe and familiar church singing sessions, but new stages, unfamiliar audiences, long trips that gradually pulled her life away from the rhythm of a normal childhood. Simple play days, purposeless afternoons, moments allowed to be tired without explanation, all gradually disappeared, giving way to schedules, responsibilities, and ever-growing expectations. While children her age were still learning how to grow up, Gladys had to learn how to stand firm under others' gazes, how to control her voice, control her emotions, and sometimes control her own fears. She was no longer singing just for herself. She sang for her family, for those who believed she could bring them to a better life. And over time, her role in the family group also changed. No one said it directly, but everyone understood that Gladys was the center, the one who kept everything running, the reason opportunities kept coming. That did not make her complacent, but made her more cautious, heavier. Each time standing on stage was no longer a moment of freedom, but a task that had to be completed. If she sang well, everything would continue. If she made a mistake, not only her, but everyone around her would have to bear the consequences. That thought crept into her mind, making each note heavier, each performance a test she was never allowed to fail. Gradually, Gladys began to understand that talent was not just a gift. It was a responsibility she could not refuse, nor could she put down. Those around her saw in her a future, an opportunity, something bigger than their reality. And when you become someone else's hope, you no longer have the right to be weak. There were days she was tired, there were times her voice was not as perfect as desired, but she still had to step onto the stage, still had to smile, still had to perform as if everything was perfect. Because to the audience, she was not just a girl singing. She was an image, a standard, something they believed in. The pressure to maintain that image gradually became an inseparable part of her life. Not only on stage, but in real life as well, she had to be careful in how she spoke, how she behaved, how she expressed herself. Small mistakes could be exaggerated, moments of weakness could be misunderstood. And over time, she began to place on herself demands that no one needed to say out loud. Must be better, must be stronger, must not be allowed to fall. Those standards did not come from any specific person, but from the fear inside her. The fear that if she could not maintain that image, everything she had built would collapse. The most painful thing was that in that journey, the initial joy of music gradually changed. When she was a child in church, she sang because she wanted to, because she felt something in every lyric. But when stepping into a wider world, music was no longer just emotion. It became work, became duty, became something she had to do even when she no longer felt relief. Not because she did not love music, but because she was no longer allowed to approach it in the simple way as before. Each song carried expectations, each performance carried pressure, and gradually she realized that what had once saved her could also become what bound her. Gladys Knight continued to move forward, continued to sing, continued to do what everyone expected. But deep inside, a part of her began to tire. Not because she was weak, but because she had been strong for too long. And perhaps it was during those years, when talent was no longer pure joy but became a burden to carry, that something changed in her. Something that later, when looking back, she would understand was the beginning of another battle, a battle no longer taking place on stage, but inside her very self. The years that followed were not a straight path leading to glory, but a long series of steps in silence, where Gladys Knight began to understand that talent was not always enough to open doors. She and her relatives in Gladys Knight and the Pips carried her voice from one place to another, from small clubs to makeshift stages, where the lights were dim and the audiences were sparse. There were nights they sang for a few dozen people. There were nights when the number of listeners was even fewer than the people on stage. But no matter how many, she still sang, still kept her voice perfect as if in front of a large theater, because that was the only way she knew to survive. No one said she was not good enough, but no one really opened a big enough opportunity to change everything. Demos were sent out, auditions were attended, fleeting promises, all gradually became a familiar part of life. There were doors that never opened, there were calls that never came, and there were short, cold answers, enough to make one wonder if they were going in the right direction. Sometimes rejection did not come in the form of words, but in the form of silence, a silence so prolonged that it made all efforts invisible. She was not the only one trying, and perhaps that was what made everything harder. In a world full of voices, having talent was no longer something special, but only the minimum condition to stay in the game. There were nights, after finishing the performance, she sat in the nearly empty space, looking at the chairs already stacked, the lights gradually turning off, and wondered if anyone really remembered her voice. There were no long rounds of applause, no fans waiting backstage, only fatigue creeping through every step as she left the place where a few hours earlier she had given her all. Moments like that were not loud, not dramatic, but they had their own weight. A weight that made one start to doubt themselves, not because of lack of faith, but because that faith received no feedback from the outside world. Time passed, and with it opportunities that seemed to arrive but then slipped away. There were times when it felt like everything was about to change, when a song got a bit more attention, when a show had more people than usual, when a name started to be mentioned in a conversation. But then everything returned to the same, as if everything only stopped at almost, never truly turning to a new page. That not only made the journey longer, but also made it more vague. When you don't know if you are getting closer or just standing still, each step becomes heavier than usual. In those years, the feeling of not belonging anywhere gradually became a familiar part in her heart. No longer the little girl in church, where everyone knew and trusted her, but not yet a recognized artist, where a name could speak for itself. She existed between two worlds, one too small to hold her, and one too big to accept her. And in the emptiness in between, she had to find her own way not to get lost. Some people around her began to go in different directions, choosing more stable, less risky paths, not because they lacked passion, but because they could not continue waiting for something uncertain. But Gladys stayed, not because she did not feel tired, but because she did not know how to give up. There was something inside her, perhaps the memory of those first days, singing in church, perhaps the faith nurtured from very early on, that did not allow her to stop. Even without guarantees, even without clear signs that everything would change, she still continued to move forward, continued to sing, continued to place hope in the smallest opportunities. And it was that quiet persistence, unseen, unrewarded, that became the foundation for everything that would come later. But at that time, in the long years of invisibility, all she had was a question repeating in her mind. Was there any place in this world truly meant for her, or would she forever stand on the edge of a dream she could never reach? The door that Gladys Knight had been waiting for through those long years finally cracked open when she and Gladys Knight and the Pips stepped into Motown, a name that at that time was almost a symbol for every music dream of black artists in America. That was not a small step forward, but a moment many would call "it's time," a sign that their relentless efforts had finally been seen. For the first time, they were no longer standing on the sidelines, no longer wondering if anyone would listen to them. Their name began to appear in bigger conversations. Opportunities that once seemed distant began to feel within reach. But right from the early days, Gladys sensed something incomplete, an invisible gap between being accepted and being valued. Motown was a perfect machine, where everything was arranged, shaped, and operated with astonishing precision. Artists who entered here not only brought their talent, but also became part of a larger system, where every voice and every song had its own place in a tightly controlled picture. And in that picture, not everyone stood at the center. Even though Gladys' voice carried a depth few possessed, even though she had proven her ability through every performance, she and her group were still not the ones prioritized. The best songs, the strongest promotional strategies, the most prominent opportunities, they were usually reserved for other names. Artists the label believed would deliver quicker and bigger results. No one said outright that she was not important enough, but the way everything unfolded spoke for itself. There were songs she believed could change everything, but were not promoted as expected. There were plans presented that she did not fully agree with, but still had to accept, because in that system, the power to decide did not lie in her hands. Choices that were not beneficial for the group gradually became familiar, from song selection and production style to image shaping. And each time, Gladys had to remind herself that this was the price of being in a place that so many others were still trying to enter. She worked harder than ever, not just singing well, but singing excellently, not just performing, but making others unable to forget. She understood that if she was not placed at the center, the only way to be seen was to become impossible to overlook. But even when she achieved that, the feeling of standing in the back did not disappear. There were moments when she saw other artists being lifted up, promoted, and celebrated, while her own efforts seemed only enough to keep her in place, rather than move her forward. What made everything harder was not obvious injustice, but quiet injustice, a form of unfairness no one mentioned, no one acknowledged, yet it was present in every decision and every missed opportunity. It was not big enough to make her leave immediately, but enough to make her always feel she never truly belonged there. And that very feeling, the feeling of being undervalued despite doing everything possible, began to sink deep into her thoughts. Gladys was not someone who easily accepted being placed in a lower position, but she was also not someone who could break the system with anger alone. She chose to continue, to keep singing, to keep working, to keep proving she deserved more. But each time she had to accept an unfair decision, each time she had to watch an opportunity pass by, a small part of her was worn away. Not her confidence, but her belief that talent and effort would eventually be treated fairly. Perhaps the most painful thing in this period was not being overlooked, but having to convince herself that it was normal, that this was just how things worked, that if she was patient long enough, everything would change. But time passed, and those changes still had not come. And while the world began to know the name Gladys Knight more, while her songs gradually found their place, inside her there still existed a question that never had a clear answer. Why, when she had done everything, had she never been allowed to stand where she truly deserved? The answer seemed to arrive, but it did not bring the feeling Gladys Knight had once waited for. When the first melodies of Midnight Train to Georgia played on the radio, everything began to change at a speed even she was not prepared for. Songs that had once been overlooked now became the voice of an entire generation. The emotion she poured into every word suddenly heard everywhere. On crowded streets, in small homes, in moments when people needed something to hold on to. Her name was no longer in faint lists, but was mentioned with clear recognition. Other songs followed with success, gradually building a position that before had always seemed out of reach. For the first time, the world not only listened but truly paid attention. Along with that success came a wave of fans she had never experienced before. Audiences who once sat sparsely in small performances were now replaced by fully packed seats, non-stop cheers, hands raised when she stepped on stage. Tours expanded, bigger venues, farther cities, all created a new rhythm of life, a rhythm where everything seemed to revolve around music and her presence. Every night, she stood under the lights, looking down at the sea of people below, and heard her own voice sung back by strangers. That was what any artist had once dreamed of, being listened to, being remembered, becoming part of someone else's life. But at the same time, something else also began to form, slowly but clearly. As the performance schedule grew denser, as flights followed one after another, as days and nights blended together in identical hotel rooms, her life began to lose its stopping points. There were no longer quiet moments to think, no longer enough time to feel, only constant movement from one place to another. The passing days were no longer marked by memories but by schedules. And in that rhythm, she began to realize that, even though she was achieving everything she had once wanted, something was no longer whole. The emptiness did not come immediately. It was not loud or clear, but it crept into every small moment. One night after a show, when she returned to the hotel room, she sat down and realized there was no one there to share the joy she had just experienced. The applause still echoed in her ears, but the room was too quiet. The praises were still there, but there was no one to look her in the eyes and understand how she truly felt. There were times she picked up the phone, wanting to call home, wanting to hear a familiar voice, but then put it down because the times no longer matched, because her life had begun to separate from the people she had once been closest to. On stage, she was the center of every gaze, but offstage, she began to feel like she was standing on the edge of her own life. The successes she achieved were not fake, but the feeling that came with them was not like what she had once imagined. She had thought that once she reached a certain point, everything would become easier, that the gaps would be filled, that the efforts would bring a sense of completeness. But reality was different. Each success only opened a new demand. Each step forward brought another pressure. And in that process, she began to wonder if she was getting closer to what she wanted or simply moving farther away from herself. There were nights, amid thousands of people, when she still felt a loneliness hard to name. It was not a lack of people around her, but a lack of real connection. The fans loved her voice, but they did not know who she was off stage. The people working with her understood the work, but they did not always understand her as a person. And amid all those relationships, she began to realize that there was a part of herself that was not being touched, a part that no song and no round of applause could fill. Success, for many people, is a destination, but for Gladys, it gradually became a state she had to learn how to exist within. It was not that she was ungrateful or did not appreciate it, but that she realized what she had obtained was not entirely the same as what she had once sought. She had fame, recognition, things that once seemed impossible to achieve. But the feeling of belonging, the feeling that she was in the right place, at the right time, as the right person, became increasingly distant. And in that contradiction, between having everything and still feeling like something was missing, a quiet question began to form, not to be answered immediately, but to follow her in the years ahead. If this is victory, then why does it not bring the feeling of a victory? Those questions did not disappear. They were only overshadowed by the increasingly relentless pace of a life that Gladys Knight no longer fully controlled. Success opened new doors, but at the same time locked away the exits she once had. The performance schedule stretched from one city to another, from one state to another, almost without stopping. Mornings began on airplanes, afternoons were sound checks, and nights ended under stage lights in front of thousands of people. Each passing day felt like an endless loop where the body had to keep operating even as it began sending signals of fatigue. The voice, the very thing that had brought her this far, also began to show signs of wear. There were days when raising her voice no longer felt as natural as before, moments when she had to try harder just to keep the sound from trembling. But stopping was not an easy choice. When an entire system was operating around her presence, stopping would not only affect herself but also many others. And so she continued. Along with the wear on her body came the gradual distancing of relationships she had once seen as her foundation. Family, once her anchor, began to feel farther away with each trip. Shared meals became rare, conversations grew shorter, and important moments in the lives of loved ones sometimes happened without her there. It was not because she did not want to be, but because the gap between work and personal life had grown so large it was hard to bridge. There were times she returned home after many weeks, even months, and realized everything was still familiar. But the feeling was no longer the same. The children grew up day by day, small changes she could not witness in time, all creating a void that no success could fill. Meanwhile, the music industry was not a place that allowed anyone to slow down. Success was not a stopping point, but the beginning of a new chain of expectations. Once you reached a certain level, you were no longer allowed to just maintain. You had to keep surpassing yourself. The songs had to be better, the performances more impressive, the numbers bigger. That pressure did not come from a single source, but from every direction. From the record label, from the audience, from the media, and from herself. Gladys understood that the position she held was not permanent. In a world always searching for something new, maintaining presence was already difficult. Maintaining the position was even harder. And so she kept working, kept appearing, kept pushing herself further, even as inside she began to feel depleted. There were moments when she felt her body resisting. Fatigue was no longer just a passing sensation, but a prolonged state. Mild pains began appearing more frequently, her voice sometimes no longer as steady as before, and her sleep became shorter and lighter. But amid all those signs, she still stood on stage, still smiled, still delivered to the audience what they expected. Not because she did not recognize her condition, but because she had grown used to placing others' needs above her own. When you have become an icon, showing weakness is no longer as simple as before. The exhaustion was not only physical, but also mental. When every day was filled with work, when every moment had a specific purpose, there was not much space left to stop and ask herself how she truly felt. Unresolved thoughts and unnamed emotions gradually accumulated, forming an invisible pressure. And in that pressure, she began to realize she was living in a constant state of moving forward without time to look back. Success had once been what she pursued, a goal, a promise of a better life. But over time, it began to carry a different meaning. It was no longer just what she received, but also what she had to trade away. Moments with family, periods of rest, opportunities to slow down, all were gradually replaced by schedules, obligations, and expectations. And in that process, she began to feel more clearly than ever that success not only brought things but also took them away. There was no single specific moment that marked this change. It did not happen in one day or arrive with a big event, but formed gradually through small experiences. A performance where she felt too tired but still had to complete. A call from family she could not answer because she was on the way to the stage. A night lying in a hotel room, staring at the ceiling and wondering when she could stop. All of those things, when added together, created a new awareness that what she had was not entirely what she had once wanted. And in that awareness, another feeling also began to appear. It was not regret, not giving up, but a profound weariness. A weariness that could not be solved by one night's sleep or a short vacation. A weariness that came from having to maintain a life with few other choices. She still continued, still stepped on stage, still raised the voice that had made her name. But deep inside, she began to understand that this path, even though it had taken her to the peak, was also gradually taking away more than it had ever promised to bring. When the trips had no stopping points, and the shows followed one another, like a breath without pause, Gladys Knight entered marriage with Barry Hankerson during a period when her career was climbing the fastest. It was a decision that came not only from affection, but also from the belief that amid all the nonstop movement of life, she could still keep a place called home, a solid enough anchor to balance what was gradually spinning out of control. At first, everything seemed like it could harmonize. Two people who understood the industry, understood the pressure, understood the cost of success. But understanding did not always mean being able to overcome it. And as life began to operate according to the tight schedule of fame, the small gaps at the beginning gradually widened into distances that were hard to fill. Time, which had already been scarce before, now barely existed in that marriage. Dinners were postponed, plans were changed, and promises of "I'll make it up later" gradually became familiar. No one intentionally hurt the other, but the repeated absences themselves became a form of quiet hurt. Conversations that once lasted long were now shortened into hurried questions and incomplete answers. There were days they were in the same space but living in two completely different rhythms. One person always preparing to leave, the other always waiting. And amid that movement, the things that had once connected them began to fade. It was not that there were no efforts. There were times they tried to sit down, tried to talk, tried to find the initial feeling again. But each time, reality would intrude. A trip that could not be canceled, a show that could not be rescheduled, an obligation that could not be ignored. Conversations became heavier, as both carried their own fatigue, and instead of finding empathy, they began to feel the differences more clearly. It was not because they no longer cared, but because the way they faced pressure was no longer the same. And when those differences were not resolved, they gradually accumulated into gaps that words could no longer bridge. There were evenings, after returning from the stage, when Gladys sat in a space that should have been the safest place but instead felt unfamiliar. It was not because the room had changed, but because the feeling inside her was different. What had once been a support now became a place where she was no longer sure she belonged. And while the outside world continued to see her as a symbol of success, inside, an important part of her life was gradually cracking. The breakdown did not come in a single moment. It was not the result of a big argument or a sudden decision. It was the result of hundreds, thousands of small moments where the connection was no longer maintained, where the things left unsaid gradually became long silences. And at some point, both realized that what had once held them together was no longer strong enough to overcome what had changed. The decision to divorce, when it came, did not bring clear relief but carried a hard-to-describe feeling of emptiness, as if a part of life had just closed without a complete ending. For Gladys, that breakdown was not just an event in her personal life, but a deep cut into how she saw herself. She had spent her entire youth building a career, proving she could overcome every limit, achieving things many only dared to dream of. But in that process, she had not kept something she once thought was equally important: family. And when facing that reality, the feeling was not failure in the eyes of the world, but failure in her own heart. There was no stage for that pain. There were no audiences applauding when you had to face what had been lost. There were only long nights, repeating thoughts, questions that were not easy to answer. She wondered if there was anything she could have done differently, if there was any moment where a different choice would have changed the outcome. But those questions brought no answers, only made the silence heavier. And in all of that, the most painful thing was not losing a relationship, but realizing that success, the thing she had pursued and achieved, could not protect the most important things from being hurt. It could open doors to many things, but could not hold on to what had begun to leave. And when she stood between two worlds, one side fame, one side what had been lost, she began to understand that there were victories that were never complete, because to achieve them, you had to trade away things there was no way to get back. After the door of marriage closed, the emptiness Gladys Knight carried did not disappear with the divorce papers. It only changed shape, becoming quieter, deeper, and harder to name. The nights returning after shows no longer had anyone waiting. The once familiar conversations now existed only in memory, and amid it all, she began to search for some way to ease the heavy feeling clinging to her. At first, stepping into the casino was not a big choice, but only a temporary escape, a place with bright lights, sound, and movement, enough to fill the silence she did not want to face. In that space, everything seemed simpler. Win or lose, gain or lose, a clear result instead of the complex emotions she could not control. And in those brief moments, when the numbers spun and the cards were flipped, she felt she could temporarily forget the things weighing on her heart. But those brief moments gradually stretched longer. The visits were no longer accidental, but became a habit. At first after shows, then before shows, then any time she felt unsteady. Gambling was no longer just entertainment, but became a way to control emotions, or at least create the illusion that she was controlling something in her life, when everything else seemed to be slipping from her grasp: relationships, time, the feeling of belonging. Placing a bet brought a clear, direct feeling that needed no explanation. But that very clarity hid something else. She was gradually losing control at a deeper level. The change did not happen in one night. It crept through small decisions, each time staying longer than intended, each time telling herself, just one more time. The initial amounts of money that were insignificant gradually became larger, but the feeling did not change. It was still the desire to find something that had been lost, and when the losses began to exceed the limits, when the numbers could no longer be easily ignored, she still continued. Not because she did not understand the consequences, but because at that time, stopping meant having to face everything she had tried to avoid. Her personal life began to be affected in ways outsiders could not easily notice. On stage, she was still the Gladys Knight the world knew, strong, in control, full of emotion. But off-stage, her decisions began to be dominated by a habit she no longer fully controlled. There were amounts of money that disappeared that she did not want to explain, periods of time no one knew where she had been, and questions she chose not to answer. Hiding became part of life, not because she wanted to deceive, but because she did not want to admit she had a problem. That hiding was not only for others, but also for herself. There were days she convinced herself everything was still okay, that she could stop anytime, that this was just a phase. But deep inside, she began to sense a different truth, that this was no longer as simple as before. Each time she stepped into the casino, each time she sat down at the betting table, she brought not only money but also unresolved emotions and unfilled voids. And the more she tried to fill them that way, the clearer they became. The feeling of shame did not come immediately, but when it appeared, it carried its own weight. It was not shame before others but before herself. She began to look back at what she had done, the decisions she had made, and realized that the image she had maintained for many years was gradually no longer matching the person she was becoming. There were moments she stood in front of the mirror and wondered who she was seeing, a successful artist or a person trying to hide a part of life she did not want to face. The loss of confidence did not come from no longer having talent, but from no longer being sure about herself. On stage, she could still control everything, could still deliver what the audience expected. But off stage, she began to doubt her decisions, doubt her ability to control her own life. And when a person who had grown used to standing firm before thousands began to doubt herself, that was not a small change. There were nights she left the casino with a more empty feeling than when she had entered. Not because she had lost, but because she realized what she was looking for was not there. But realizing did not mean being able to stop immediately. Like many other habits, it had become part of how she faced life, and changing it required more than a simple decision. It required confrontation, confronting what she had avoided, what she had lost, what she had never truly dealt with. And in that process, she began to understand that what was threatening her was not what the world saw but what was happening inside. There were no newspaper headlines about those nights, no audiences witnessing those decisions, but they had the power to destroy what she had built more than anything else. Success had once placed her in a position many admired, but it was precisely in the shadow of that success that she had come close to a point where, if she didn't stop, she could lose not only money, not only fame, but herself. Those nights kept repeating until there came another night. A night when Gladys Knight could no longer pretend that everything was still under control. There was no loud incident, no one standing up to criticize, no spotlight shining on that moment. There was only her, alone, in the familiar space of the betting tables, when the chips in front of her no longer carried the same meaning as before. She looked down at her own hands, hands that had once gripped the microphone tightly, that had once created melodies that brought others to tears. And in that moment, she no longer recognized the woman sitting there. It was not because her appearance had changed, but because the feeling inside her was different. There was a gap between the person she once was and the person she was becoming, and that gap could no longer be hidden. That was not the first time she felt herself slipping away from who she was, but it was the first time she stopped long enough to truly look at it. There was no longer casino noise loud enough to distract her, no more excuses to justify it, no more phrases like, "Everything will be okay," to comfort herself. Only the truth remained, raw and unavoidable. She had changed in a way she herself did not want. The decisions she once believed were temporary had become habits. The things she once thought she could control were now controlling her. And in that realization, a feeling of being lost spread, not because she did not know where she was, but because she was no longer sure who she was. Fame was still there. The songs still played on the radio. The performances were still scheduled. The fans still waited. From the outside, nothing had really changed. But inside, everything was different. There was a clear separation between the image the world saw and the person she felt herself to be. On stage, she could still become who everyone expected, strong, in control, full of emotion. But when she stepped down, when the lights went out, she had to face a version of herself that she did not know how to accept. And it was that very discrepancy between the two worlds that made her feel like she was living in a reality she did not fully belong to. Questions began to appear, not to find answers right away, but like echoes that could not be silenced. She wondered when she had started to veer off course, when small choices became big changes, when seeking relief turned into dependence. There was no clear timeline, no single event to point to, only a chain of decisions following one after another, each one seeming reasonable at the time, but in hindsight leading to a result she had never wanted. The feeling of no longer recognizing her own worth did not come from losing talent or success, but from no longer believing that those things defined who she was. If her voice could not save her from wrong choices, if fame could not bring peace, then what did those things really mean? Those questions were not easy to answer, and in many moments, they only made the silence heavier. Because when you are no longer sure of your own value, everything around you also begins to lose its original meaning. The collapse did not happen like a storm. It did not rush in and sweep everything away in one moment. It was like a slow disintegration, where small parts inside you began to fall out of place, where the things that once held you together were no longer strong enough. And what made it hardest to face was that it happened in silence. No one saw it, no one intervened, no one forced you to stop. You could still go on living as usual, still complete your work, still smile in front of others. But inside, you knew something had broken. That night, when Gladys stood up and left the betting table, nothing changed immediately. The casino was still bright, the sounds still rang out, life outside continued as always. But in her heart, something had shifted. It was not resolution, not healing, but realization that she could not continue like this forever. That if she did not change, this path would lead to a place she did not want to go. And realizing that did not bring relief, but a heavier feeling, because it came with the responsibility to do something different. She stepped outside, took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long while, she did not try to fill the emptiness with anything. No music, no noise, no distraction. Only stillness, and in that stillness she began to hear herself, not the voice the world knew, but the inner voice she had tried to avoid. And even though that voice did not yet provide answers, it did something more important. It made her unable to continue pretending that everything was okay. That night did not bring immediate answers, but it left a different kind of silence. A silence no longer used to hide, but one that forced Gladys Knight to listen. In the days that followed, she no longer ran after familiar sounds to fill the void. The trips still happened, the shows still continued, but inside, something had changed. No more denial, no more hurried reassurances. Instead, there was a truth she could no longer avoid. If she continued living as before, she would lose the rest of herself. And for the first time in a long time, she did not try to escape that thought. She stayed with it. The decision to face it did not come as a grand, courageous moment, but as a weariness that had reached its limit. She had tried avoiding, tried controlling, tried convincing herself everything was still okay. But after all that, those ways only prolonged the problem, did not solve it. And when you have tried every way and still found no escape, stopping and looking straight at the problem was no longer the scariest choice. It became the only one left. Gladys began to admit to herself the things she had not wanted to name before. Not public failures, but internal deviations, habits that had gone beyond control, emotions that had never been fully dealt with. Naming them did not make them disappear, but made them more real, clearer, and impossible to ignore. In that process, she returned to what had once been her foundation, faith. Not as a quick fix, but as an anchor she had drifted away from during all the years of chasing other things. Memories of the church in Atlanta, of Sunday mornings, of the feeling of raising her voice not for anyone else but for herself, began to come back. But this time, they did not carry the innocence of a child, but the understanding of someone who had been through much loss. She did not turn to faith to escape reality, but to have enough strength to face it. And in that return, she began to feel something she had not felt in a long time, calmness, however fragile. Accepting that she needed help was not an easy step, especially for someone who had grown used to standing firm on her own under every gaze. Gladys had spent her whole life becoming someone others relied on, someone who brought emotion, someone who kept everything running. Admitting she could not solve everything by herself went against the image she had built. But the more she tried to hold on to that image, the more she felt it drifting from her true self. And at some point, maintaining the image was no longer as important as holding on to herself. She began to open up, began to speak about the things she had previously kept only to herself. Not to everyone, but to those she trusted, to places where she could be heard without judgment. The initial changes were not big, not loud, not turning point-like as outsiders might expect. They happened in small choices, in her decision not to step into the casino, in spending time on things that had previously been overlooked, in the way she began to reevaluate what was truly important. The old habits did not disappear immediately, but they were no longer the only option. And each time she chose differently, even if just once, she was creating a small distance between herself and the person she did not want to become. Changing the way she thought was perhaps the hardest part. It was not about learning something new, but about letting go of what had taken root for many years. She began to ask herself, not what do I have to do to keep this position, but what kind of person do I want to become? That shift did not happen immediately, but it opened a direction not based only on other people's expectations, but on honesty with herself. And in that process, she gradually realized that her worth did not lie in what she could do on stage, but in how she could live when no one was watching. Calmness did not come as a reward, but as a result of no longer running away. When she sat alone, no longer trying to fill the silence, she began to feel a different kind of quiet. Not emptiness, but a space where she could breathe without pretending. It was not perfect, it did not last forever, but it was real. And in that truth, she found something she had lost for a long time: the ability to stay with herself without feeling afraid. No one stood on stage to witness this moment. There were no lights, no rounds of applause. But it was precisely in that silence that a decision was made, a decision not to change the world, but to change the person she would become from that point forward. And though the road ahead was still long and full of uncertainties, for the first time in many years, Gladys did not step forward because she was pushed, but because she had chosen to walk. The first steps after facing it did not bring immediate relief. They simply opened a path that Gladys Knight knew she had no other choice but to continue on. Recovery did not happen in one moment. It was not a promise that could be kept by willpower in a single day. It was a long, repeated process where every day demanded a new decision. The decision not to return to what had once brought easy feelings, but left long-term consequences. There were days she felt she was moving forward, days when everything became harder, when old habits tried to come back, when unresolved emotions rose up more strongly. But this time, instead of avoiding them, she stayed with them, learned to understand them, and more importantly, learned not to let them dictate her actions. Regaining control over herself was not just about giving up a habit, but also about changing the way she lived each day. Things that once seemed small, quiet mornings, unhurried meals, periods of time not dominated by schedules, now became the foundation for a new life. Gladys began to rebuild from the most basic things, no longer trying to change everything at once, but focusing on each small step. Each day was no longer measured by the number of tasks completed, but by whether she could maintain balance, whether she could get through a day without losing herself. One of the hardest things was not changing behavior, but changing the way she saw herself. The shame did not disappear the moment she decided to change. It was still there, like a voice reminding her of what had happened, of the choices she was not proud of. There were times she looked back at the past and felt heavy, wondering why she had let things go so far. But gradually, she understood that if she held on to that self-blame, she would not be able to move forward. Forgiving herself was not denying what had happened, but accepting that she had been wrong, had learned, and deserved another chance. It was not a single decision, but a process where she had to remind herself many times that she was not only the mistakes she had made. As self-blame gradually receded, something else began to appear, a feeling she had not clearly felt in a long time: self-respect. It was not loud confidence, not the image others saw, but an inner certainty that she was heading in the right direction. It did not come from big successes, but from small choices repeated every day, from keeping promises to herself, from not going back to what had hurt her, from daring to face emotions instead of avoiding them. And it was precisely those things, even though no one saw them, that became the foundation for a new confidence, a confidence that did not depend on other people's gaze. When she returned to music, everything was no longer the same as before. The stage was still there, the audience was still there, her voice still carried the power the world was familiar with. But the way she stood on stage was different. It was no longer about proving something, no longer about meeting every expectation, but a more authentic presence. She sang not just to be heard, but to connect, not only with the audience, but with herself. The songs she performed carried more than technique or surface emotion. They carried experience, what she had been through, what she had learned. And perhaps that was why they touched listeners in a different way, not just because of the sound, but because of the truth inside. Not everyone noticed this change, and perhaps she did not need them to, because what mattered was not what others saw, but what she felt when standing there. For the first time in many years, music was no longer an obligation, but returned to being a part of who she was, a part not driven by pressure, but nurtured by honesty. She no longer sang to fill the void, but sang from a place that had begun to heal. The process of rebuilding life had no clear ending. It was not a story that could be wrapped up in a single victory moment. It was an ongoing journey, where each day brought its own challenges, but also opportunities to choose differently. Gladys Knight did not return to the person she was before because she was no longer that person. She became a new version, a version that had gone through mistakes, had faced herself, and had chosen not to let those things define her entire life. And in that journey, though imperfect, she found something she had always searched for, but had never been able to keep: the feeling that she could live with herself without needing to run away. Those quiet changes gradually led Gladys Knight to a stage she had never truly experienced before. A stage where life no longer revolved around having to prove or chase something, but began to be built on presence and conscious choice. When she met and entered marriage with William McDowell, it was no longer a decision born from lack or the desire to fill a void, but a companionship that came from maturity. Unlike what she had experienced before, this relationship was not swept along by the pace of fame or the pressure to maintain an image. It was slow, stable, and most importantly, it did not require her to become any version other than herself. For the first time in many years, Gladys no longer needed to leave constantly to maintain her position. The tours were still there, music was still an important part of her life, but they no longer occupied all the space. She began to spend time with family in the way she had always wanted, but could not do before. Meals were no longer cut short by schedules, conversations no longer had to be rushed, and moments together were no longer rare. It was not that she had never had a family, but this time she was truly present in it, not just physically but emotionally as well. There were mornings that began in quiet, with no calls to be somewhere, no immediate to-do lists. She woke up not to chase a schedule, but to live in a day where she could set her own rhythm. Things that once seemed simple: a cup of coffee, a light conversation, an unplanned afternoon. Things that had previously been seen as unimportant now carried a different meaning. They were not gaps between successes, but life itself that she had missed for many years. Joy no longer came from rounds of applause or numbers, but from the small things she could feel completely: a laugh within the family, an uninterrupted moment of peace, a feeling that she did not need to be anywhere else but where she was standing. All created a kind of happiness she had not truly understood before. It was not intense or explosive, but it was lasting, and that very lasting quality made it more precious than anything she had ever chased. The biggest difference was not in the circumstances, but in the way she experienced them. Before, even in peaceful moments, her mind was still pulled by worries, plans, and things not yet done. But now, she learned to stay in the present, not letting the past pull her down, not letting the future make her anxious. The peace she felt was not because all problems had disappeared, but because she no longer let them take up all the space in her mind. Of course, the memories did not disappear. What she had been through was still there, an inseparable part of who she was. But they no longer carried the same weight as before. Instead of things that made her feel ashamed or regretful, they became lessons, milestones, reminding her of the path she had walked. And precisely because she had gone through those stages, she treasured what she had in the present even more. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. In that peace, Gladys no longer felt she had to search for a place to belong. She had found it, not on a stage, not in other people's recognition, but in the very life she was building every day. A life that did not need to be loud to have meaning, did not need to be seen to have value. And perhaps, for the first time in many years, she no longer felt she was trying to hold on to something, but was simply living with it. This peace did not come as a reward, but as a result of everything she had been through. The mistakes, the losses, the times she stood before choices and decided to change. It was not perfect, not immune to difficulties, but it was solid enough for her to lean on without fear of being pulled away. And in that steadiness, Gladys Knight was no longer someone chasing a dream, but someone who had found something even more important. A place where she could stay, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Time, in the end, also placed its hand on Gladys Knight's shoulder in a way no voice can escape. The passing years were no longer measured by the number of tours or new hits, but by the very real changes in her body. Slower steps, mornings that took longer to begin, moments when she clearly felt her energy was not the same as before. Her voice was still there, still carrying the depth a lifetime had forged, but it had also changed. No longer an unlimited explosion, but a conscious flow, kept more carefully. And in that change, she did not resist, did not try to cling to a version that belonged to the past, but began to learn to listen to her body like a companion that had been with her through everything. When the pace of life slowed, memories also became clearer. No longer obscured by a packed schedule or goals to achieve, the past returned in its own way, not loud, not imposing, but deep enough to make her pause and think. The days in Atlanta, the Sunday mornings in church, the invisible years, the bright stages, the losses, and the times she stood back up, all present at once, like layers of memories stacked on top of each other. Some memories brought smiles, some carried sadness, but none truly disappeared. They existed as part of who she was, not to pull her back but to remind her how far she had come. There were nights when the stage lights went out and there were no more rounds of applause, when the quiet became clearer than ever. It was not the emptiness of before, but a silence she had to learn to live with. In those moments, loneliness did not come as something negative, but as an unavoidable truth. When you have lived a life full of movement, standing still can feel strange. And when you have grown used to being surrounded by sound, silence can feel too loud. But this time, Gladys did not run from it. She stayed, listened, and gradually understood that loneliness is not always something that needs to be filled. Sometimes it is simply space for her to face herself without any role. Looking back at life no longer carried the feeling of having to judge or compare. She no longer asked herself how many things she had done right or wrong, how much she had achieved, what she had lost. Those questions had meaning in other stages, but now they were no longer the center. Instead, there was acceptance that life is not a series of perfect decisions, but a journey with every shade. There were things she would do differently if given the chance, but there were also things, however difficult, that had shaped her in ways nothing else could. Slowing down was not giving up, but changing the way she was present. She no longer needed to prove she could still do what she had done before. She no longer needed to chase standards that time had changed. Instead, she chose what suited her in the present. Performances she truly wanted to join, moments she could enjoy fully, days when she allowed herself to rest without feeling guilty. That choice did not make her smaller, but made her more real. There is a freedom in accepting that you are no longer as you once were and do not need to be. That freedom is not loud, not announced, but it is present in the way she lives, in the way she speaks, in the way she walks. Gladys Knight is no longer someone trying to hold on to everything she had, but someone choosing to keep what is truly important. And in that section, she found a different kind of peace. A kind of peace that does not come from everything being perfect, but from no longer needing to be perfect. Time continues to pass, as it always does, but this time Gladys does not feel she is being swept along. She walks with it at a rhythm she can accept. The memories are still there. The sounds of the past still echo in certain moments, but they no longer control the present. And when she looks to the future, not with anxiety or expectation, but with a rare serenity, she understands that what matters most is not how much time is left, but how she will live that remaining time. And then, when all the sounds gradually quieted down, when the tours no longer followed one after another as before, the life of Gladys Knight appeared not as a series of brilliant peaks, but as a long journey with bumpy roads where every step left its mark. From a little girl in a church in Atlanta, where her voice was born from faith and Sunday mornings, to a young teenager stepping onto big stages too soon, carrying her family's expectations as an inseparable part, she did not have a complete childhood in the way many people imagine. Those early years did not just teach her how to sing, but taught her how to endure, how to continue even when not ready, how to become what others needed before she had time to understand who she really was. Then came the long years of invisibility, when talent was not enough to open doors, when rejections came more often than opportunities, when every step forward was unclear. She stayed through those years not because she was sure of success, but because she did not know how to give up. And when the door finally opened, when her music was heard, when her songs played everywhere, success came like an answer, but not the answer to everything. It brought recognition and position, but did not bring the completeness she once thought it would bring. In that journey, what she gained and what she lost always went hand in hand. Every bigger stage meant greater distances in her personal life. Every career step forward brought things she had to let go of. There were relationships that could not be kept, moments that could not be returned to, parts of life she could only look back at from afar. Success was not a straight road leading to happiness, but a road with turns where every choice had its price. And sometimes that price was only clearly understood after it had been paid. The mistakes did not come as single big events, but accumulated over time, through choices that seemed small but left long-lasting consequences. Turning to ways to fill the emptiness, avoiding difficult emotions, believing she could control everything. All of it led her to moments when she no longer recognized herself. But looking back, those very mistakes were also part of the journey. Not to justify, but to understand that a person is not defined only by what they do right. There are things that can only be learned by going wrong, by facing consequences, by accepting that one is not perfect. True value, what she had searched for over many years, did not lie in what others saw. It did not lie in the number of records sold, in the awards, or in the position she had reached. Those things had meaning, but they were not the foundation for a life where she could feel peace. True value lay in being able to live with herself, without hiding, without proving, without chasing any image. It lay in being able to look back at the past without being pulled down by it, to look at the present without feeling lacking, and to step into the future without carrying fear. The serenity she gained was not something that came naturally, but the result of everything she had been through. It was not that everything had been resolved, but that she no longer needed to resolve everything. There were questions that did not need answers, memories that did not need to be changed, parts of life that only needed to be accepted. And in that acceptance, She found a different way of existing, not based on achieving, but on being present. Gladys Knight is no longer the little girl who had to prove she was worthy, no longer the woman who had to hold on to everything at all costs, no longer the image the world expected. She is a person who has been through enough to understand that her worth does not change according to what she has or does not have. And it is precisely in that understanding that she continues to live, not to gain more but to live fully with what she has. Not to forget the past, but to carry it without being controlled by it. The world may continue to remember her through her songs, through her moments on stage, through achievements not everyone reaches. But there is a truth not everyone sees, a truth not in the music or the fame, but in the way she exists after it all. A truth that sometimes the hardest thing is not achieving something, but keeping yourself in the process. And in a life where so many things have changed, have come and gone, what is most worth saying is not who she became in the eyes of the world, but that she is still herself when no one is looking. The story of Gladys Knight does not touch people because of loud tragedies, but because of the quiet cracks that stretched throughout her entire life. From the little girl in the church in Atlanta, who had to grow up too soon, to the woman sitting alone in the casino trying to find the sense of control that fame could not bring. The compassion lies in the fact that she spent her entire youth meeting the expectations of family and the public, but did not have the chance to understand herself until everything was almost out of control. The years of being overlooked at Motown, where she had to stand in the back despite proving her ability, or the marriage to Barry Hankerson that fell apart due to lack of presence, all show a familiar paradox in American society. External success does not guarantee inner stability. Especially, the period when she sank into gambling was not just a personal mistake, but reflected how many Americans face pressure, turning to quick escapes instead of confronting real pain. But what makes this story worthy of honor is not the falls, but the way she stood back up, returning to faith, accepting the need for help, and step-by-step rebuilding her life from the smallest things. In a culture that values achievement and speed, Gladys Knight's journey reminds us that true value does not lie in how much you achieve, but in whether you can keep yourself. For the American people, those always caught in the wheel of success, the lesson here is very clear. Do not wait until you are sitting alone in the casino of life to realize you have gone too far. Stop earlier, listen to yourself, and have the courage to change before everything becomes irreparable. If the story of Gladys Knight makes you think about your own journey, please hit subscribe and leave a heart as a token of gratitude for a person who chose to stand up instead of losing herself. Thank you for staying until the end, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore stories not only about success, but about how people learn to exist after it all.